So I'm coming up this primarily from an editing perspective of how different ways you can play with telling a story once you have actually captured it. But you can also use this when you're writing something. So if you're doing a script, you're trying to design a story, you can also use this kind of way of looking at stories. So this is kind of primarily from an editing perspective, but it could be either pre or post-production or both. So let me move on. So who's seen Finding Nemo? I can't pronounce it in Portuguese, but...
Nemo.
Nemo? Procurando Nemo. Could anyone tell me in like 3 sentences the story of the movie? Go for it, Yurza.
Nemo decides to go on an adventure against his dad's will, and his dad freaks out and decides to team up with Dory to find him. And then at the end, they rescue him after a long, beautiful journey.
Yeah, it is a long and beautiful journey. Who cries watching this movie? I definitely cry watching this movie. Did you know that wasn't actually the original story? So, originally, the actual story of Finding Nemo wasn't going to be told with so it opens with like a barracuda attack. The main fish, Marlin, loses his wife and all of their kids bar Nemo. And then the rest of the story kind of sets up Marlin wanting to protect Nemo, but then Nemo getting captured. Originally, that wasn't the story that they were going to tell. Originally, it opens with Nemo going on the adventure, Nemo getting captured, and then Marlin freaking out and having to go find Nemo. And then as the story progresses, you have all these flashbacks to meeting Marlin, Marlin meeting his wife, and then the barracuda attack where Marlin loses his wife and all of their kids. And so the context for why Marlin is the way he is isn't really revealed until the last 15 minutes of the story. Now, what's interesting, well actually I'd love to hear what you guys think. If you didn't know the information about Marlin being a father who lost his wife and kids, how would you view his behaviour with Nemo? Do you think it would change the way you saw him as a character? Why? What would it change?
He'd just be really grumpy and annoying. Like, what's wrong with Marlin?
Yeah. Anyone else got anything to add to that?
Well, I feel like he'd understand why he is the way he is if he knew the backstory. Yeah. You'd kind of go, I get it.
Exactly.
I was feeling that way.
100%. So when Pixar was doing screening tests of the original plan for Finding Nemo, people kept saying, hey, we actually really hate Marlin and he's the main character. Like no one really likes him until the last 15 minutes. And if it's an hour and a half long film, that's a long time to not like your main character when you should sympathize with him.
Right.
So this is kind of feeding into today's session, which is about some ways to tell a story. So I'm going to kind of go through different kind of storytelling structures and ways that you can use them to play with how you tell your story. So these are not rules necessarily. These are more like, think of them like nice diagrams visually for you to think about how you tell a story. So does that make sense? There's any questions on that?
Yeah,
Cool.
This is good.
All right, so the first one is your Finding Nemo story, the way it actually was told, which is chronological. So if we're starting at 9 a.m. this morning, our story is going to follow exactly along the timeline to, 2:10 today. So it's a consistent storyline. It doesn't divert or change or flip around between different time periods. So it follows the timeline without deviation. There's no flashbacks. There's no kind of weird Inception kind of changing with the timeline or like not knowing what time it is. It's all just consistent. So it has a clear start and a clear finish point. And so questions you might consider as you're trying to tell a story that is chronological is, okay, if I've got all this content from 9 a.m. till 2:10 p.m., what stories do you include? Which ones do you cut? Which ones do you zoom in on? Which ones do you kind of skip over a little bit? Is that making sense? All right, so being a little bit of a nerd, I thought I'd give some examples of films that do that. So obviously Finding Nemo. Who loves Star Wars? Star Wars? Yeah, so Star Wars is an excellent example of very good chronological films. Every single film just follows the timeline exactly. Past Lives is a really beautiful Korean-American film. That one's gorgeous. Basically every single Disney princess movie alive follows the chronological thing. Everything just follows the timeline to a T. Then you have my favorite, non-linear. Non-linear completely scraps your timeline in some ways. So non-linear wants to reveal the story in an unexpected manner. So this is where flashbacks can be really helpful. So you can kind of jump back and forth along the timeline. or you could completely reshuffle the way that your story is told. So for example, you could literally get all your scenes, lay them out on a table, and then just shuffle them up and see what happens, see what story kind of comes out. You could follow particular themes that are illuminated in your story. So instead of following a timeline or like things in order of events, you might follow an emotional timeline, or you might follow a conceptual timeline, or follow a character, a whole bunch of different things. So questions you might consider in this is, how did these characters or events relate to each other beyond simply they happened in sequence? Or what connects them? And so then other things to consider is like, how do you maintain clarity in your story? So how do you make sure that people can see what's happening clearly? How do you help them connect the ideas that you're connecting well? But do you want it to be clear? If you want to be really particularly abstract, this is a great way to keep it abstract. Is that making sense? Any questions on that one? All right, so some films that do that. So the Eddie documentary is a bit non-linear. So it follows the timeline for the most part, but then we'll also jump back and forth between different periods. So thank you, Sean, for an excellent example there. Who's watched The Princess Bride? This is a favourite film of mine. So Princess Bride is a non-linear film in that it follows a story, but then it has a secondary story that is bouncing in between, and so you're jumping between the story that's being told and the other one that's actually happening. That's the telling of the story. And there's the film called Blackfish. Has anyone seen Blackfish? Blackfish is a great documentary about orcas at SeaWorld, and that one does not follow the timeline at all. It often dives into court cases, and then it dives into history, then it dives into people's experiences. It's very all over the place, but it still has an amazing emotional narrative, and it still has this incredible, like almost thriller-like feel to it. Then you've got a circular one. So a circular narrative uses one central narrative to start and end your story. So for example, actually in feedback that I got yesterday for the Maya story, Sean mentioned it would be great to have something that bookends your story, that kind of shows where you were and how things change. So circular narratives could start and finish on the exact same story, or they could start and finish on a similar story that kind of completes what you saw at the start. So what's fun about a circular narrative is that you can reveal things to the audience straight away and get them hooked, and then kind of build up this tension to finish it. So I can't remember, I don't know if it was Calaton or Yurusa talking yesterday about, on social media, when you have people have the big, exciting start of a video, but then all of a sudden you're waiting for 2 minutes to see why it ended up that way, and then it finally loops back to the start and you see why things happened. That's a circular narrative. So your audience, technically speaking, knows what happens, but they don't know why it happened. And so a question for you as a storyteller then is, how do you keep people engaged with your story when they technically in some way know how the story ends? Is that making sense? Any questions on that? So some really awesome films. There's a great sci-fi film called Arrival that completely plays with that circular narrative. Like, you have no clue at which point the timeline actually happens. You don't know if you're in the present or in the past or in the future, because it follows this kind of circular narrative. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the Narnia stories, they all have a circular narrative because they all start somewhere and then suddenly you enter the world. And then you kind of come back changed, but still back where you started. Like, there's a great shot of, when Lucy goes through the wardrobe and she goes into Narnia, they have this big adventure, all the children end up in the wardrobe. Then they come back to the wardrobe at the end and they fall back literally a second after they left went into the wardrobe. So that's still a circular narrative. This is a French film at the end called La Jetée. It's a 30-minute short film. It's on YouTube. I can give you the link if you're keen to see it. This is a really fun film as well because it is entirely made up of photographs, except for 3 seconds of footage. But it also plays with that circular narrative of time travel and how that impacts the story. And it kind of starts and finishes on this particular scene, and you don't know why this scene's important until the very end. So that's a really great, I'm a very big fan of that film. So these are some cool examples of circular narrative. Final one is a parallel narrative. So you often have two stories. You can have multiple stories, but you generally speaking have about two stories. They're kind of sitting together and tied together by particular common threads. So for example, a theme or an event, or contrasting perspectives on a particular topic. So parallel narratives often get used when you have people investigating or researching something, or if they're talking about a particular historical event, you've got different people talking about their experiences with it or the research they've done. They might have arguments about or different contrasting opinions on how things happened or why things happened. So things to consider as a storyteller are both your stories strong enough to sit side by side each other? Or is one gonna be more powerful than the other? How do you make sure that they're both equally powerful and equally pushing the story along? What connects them? What are the key ideas that really bring them together? And how do you maintain tension between the two so that your audience is really keen to see it? So parallel narratives often occur in like TV shows, and you've got particular characters that you're like, I really want to know what's going on with this character, but then man, this plot line with this extra character, I'm not really keen on this. Can we just skip this bit? That's kind of one of those things to consider with parallel narratives, is how do they both maintain tension, maintain excitement. You want to know what both characters are doing, even if you're not like seeing them at the same time. Does that make sense? All right, so some good parallel narrative stories. La La Land is kind of a funny one in that you have these, like, have you seen La La Land? Okay, so the opening of La La Land is really fascinating in that you've got these two different characters who basically, they meet for a moment, and then they go away and they do their own thing for an entire day, and then suddenly they meet again. And then most of the story is them together, and then all of a sudden it's parallel narratives again. So that's one way of doing a parallel narrative. There's a film called Misbehavior that does a similar thing where you've got, I think, 2 or 3 different plot lines happening at once, all around the same event. And I think only once do the characters actually overlap each other, and it's at when the particular event actually comes to happen. And then Little Women is different in that you've got the same characters throughout the timeline, but one timeline is about 10, 15 years earlier, and the following one's about 10 years later. So you've got the same people, and you've got parallels between similar events, but they're at different time periods.
Like, would parallel be good for like documentaries, like around these things, like a hurricane or whatever? And
Yeah.
Documenting different families and
100%. Yeah. Is there any questions on that one or any further queries? All right, because we're now going to have a play with structures. So I'm not going to talk at you guys anymore. We're going to actually just have a little go. Is it okay if I run a little tiny bit over time? Great. So what I've done is I've chopped up a bunch of questions. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to help each other tell our own stories, because we need something to tell a story about. So what I've done is I've written out 4 questions about how you came to faith. So it's kind of like a mini interview situation, but you're going to interview yourself in some ways. So I'm just going to give you guys 5 minutes, like 3 to 5 minutes, just sit down and think about, like, just write some answers to the questions. They don't need to be detailed. They just need to be enough that you can kind of go, oh yeah, that's a talking point. I can talk about that. Because then what's going to happen is you're going to pair up and you're going to play with trying to tell those stories using those different structures. Does that make sense? I've also tried to translate it into Portuguese using Google Translate, so hopefully that's helpful. I'm sorry if it's a really crummy translation. Yeah, but what you're going to do is just write some answers to the questions and then we'll pair up. So I'll hand them out. There we go. So those are the Portuguese versions. I'm very sorry. That you're like, oh, that really worked. That was actually really hard. That was really surprising. What did you?
For me, it was only possible to do the second version of telling the story. Because Thiago told me the linear one. So I was only able to rearrange the story because I knew how it was like linearly. So if he didn't told me and we had to jump to the second option, I wasn't be able to do that. So it was pretty easier and made sense to construct it that way.
Yeah, it's true. I think if we started with the non-linear... I think what he was saying, if we had started with the non-linear one, I wouldn't be able to tell it chronologically. Otherwise, I can do it.
And I think that also sharing it in different, did I just turn it off? Oh, okay. Sharing it in different structures, you can like really see different themes that get highlighted when you do it in a non-linear format versus a linear format. And so Libby and I we really enjoyed looking through that throughout our exercise. So, yeah.
Anyone else notice anything? All right. Well, then I'll wrap up so that we can go into the next workshop. So.